There's a box sitting on my kitchen table right now. Cardboard, old, the corners soft from years of being moved from attic to basement to closet. My daughter brought it over last spring when she was cleaning out the storage unit we'd kept since my wife passed. I hadn't opened it in probably 30 years. Inside were my father's things, not many. A watch, some folded letters, a few photographs, and 4 small notebooks filled front to back in his handwriting. I'm George. I'm 81 years old, and I need to tell you something that has shaken me more deeply than almost anything in my life. I did not know my father. I thought I did. I was certain I did. But I didn't know him at all. He died in 1987. He was 74. I was 43 at the time, a grown man with my own children, my own mortgage, my own life running at full speed. I remember standing at his graveside thinking that we'd had a good relationship, solid, respectful. That's the word I would have used. We were respectful of each other. I thought that meant something. I thought respect and closeness were the same thing, and it took me 38 years and 4 worn-out notebooks to understand that they are not even remotely the same. My father's name was Harold James Mercer. He was born in 1913 in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, the third of 5 children. His own father worked in a coal operation, and Harold grew up understanding very early that life was something you endured with your head down and your complaints kept private. That was the culture he came from. Men didn't explain themselves. Men didn't sit down and describe what they were feeling or what they were afraid of. Men worked, and they provided. And when they came home, they sat in their chair, and they were present in body, and that was considered enough. That was, in fact, considered a success. And by those standards, my father was a tremendous success. He worked at the same manufacturing plant for 31 years. He never missed a mortgage payment. He coached my Little League team for 2 seasons, even though he worked 6 days a week. He came to my high school graduation and sat in the bleachers in his good shirt, and I remember he shook my hand after and said, "Well done, son." 2 words, "Well done." I carried those 2 words with me for years as evidence that he was proud of me. 2 words over 18 years of growing up in his house, and I treated them like a trophy. I don't say that with bitterness. I want to be very clear about that, because this is not a story about resentment. I'm past the age where resentment is useful to me, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever felt it toward him, not really. What I felt most of my life, if I'm honest, was a kind of low background confusion, a sense that there was a door in our relationship I had never been able to find, let alone open. I assumed the door wasn't there. I assumed what I saw was everything there was to see. When I was about 12 years old, I asked my father if he was happy. I have no idea what made me ask it. Children sometimes ask the exact right terrible question without knowing why. We were in the garage. He was doing something with the lawnmower, and I just looked at him and asked, "Dad, are you happy?" He stopped what he was doing. He looked at me for what felt like a very long time, and then he said, "Go see if your mother needs any help." That was it. That was the entire conversation. I walked back into the house, and I never asked him anything like that again. For nearly 7 decades, I interpreted that moment as a simple deflection. A man who didn't engage with that kind of question because that kind of question wasn't part of his world. I had decided, without ever examining the decision that my father was simply not a man who had a rich inner life, that he was what he appeared to be, steady, quiet, dutiful, a little distant, a good man, but a simple one. And I'm ashamed to tell you that I believed that until I was 81 years old, and I opened 4 small notebooks and discovered I was completely wrong. The first notebook starts in 1951. My father would have been 38. I was 7 years old that year. The handwriting is careful, almost formal, like he was aware that someone might read it someday, or maybe like he'd never had much cause to write casually and didn't know any other way. The first entry is only a few sentences long. It says, and I've read this so many times now that I have it memorized. It says, I find it hard to account for the time. The days go by, and I cannot say what I've done with them that matters. Work is good, family is good, but I have a feeling I cannot name that sits just under everything. I read that sentence, and I had to put the notebook down and walk to the window. Because I know that feeling. I have lived with that feeling for most of my adult life. A low, unnameable presence beneath the surface of ordinary days. I always thought it was particular to me, something in my own character, maybe even something slightly wrong with me. And here was my father in 1951 writing the same thing in the same careful hand. We shared something profound and fundamental, and we never once spoke of it, not once, in 43 years of being alive at the same time. There is a long entry from the spring of 1959 where he writes about a job offer he received to move the family to Ohio, a management position that would have nearly doubled his salary. I knew nothing about this. My mother never mentioned it, and my father certainly never did. In the entry, he goes back and forth for 3 pages, which is extraordinary for him, because most entries are a paragraph, maybe 2. He writes about what it would mean to leave Pennsylvania, to take his children away from their grandparents, to start over in a city where he knew no one. He writes about my mother, about how much she loved the house they'd made together. He writes about me specifically. I was 15 at the time, and he says he worried about uprooting a teenage boy from his friends during years when friendships matter so much. He turned the job down. He never told me he'd turned it down, or that it had ever existed, or that part of his reason was me. I have thought about this almost every day since I read it. My father made a significant sacrifice that touched my life directly, and he went to his grave without ever mentioning it. Not for recognition, not to be thanked. He just did it and moved on and kept showing up to the plant every morning and coaching Little League on Saturday and saying, "Well done," at graduations. I used to think his silence was emptiness. I understand now that for him, silence was the language of love. It was the only one he'd ever been taught. There are entries about faith that surprised me deeply. My father was a church-going man, and I always assumed it was habitual more than sincere, something you did in those days in that kind of town because everyone did it. But in the notebooks, he wrestles with it, genuinely wrestles, the way a man wrestles with something that matters to him enormously. He questions, he doubts, he comes back. There's an entry from around 1963 where he writes about sitting in the pew one Sunday morning and feeling, for just a moment, what he calls a certainty I cannot argue with. He can't describe it more than that, but he writes that it was enough to carry him for a long time. I read that and thought of every Sunday I sat beside him in that same church and looked at his profile, so still and unreadable, and assumed he was simply going through the motions. He was having an entirely different experience than the one I had assigned to him. There is an entry about me from 1968, the year I left for college. I was not prepared for this one. He writes that the house felt different the first night after I left. He doesn't overdo it. This is still Harold Mercer writing, so there are no declarations, no floods of emotion. But he writes that he stood in the door of my bedroom for a while that evening, and he thought about all the things he had meant to say over the years. He doesn't list what those things were. He just writes that he hoped somehow I knew them anyway, that he hoped the things a man couldn't find the words for could still travel across the distance between people. That love, unexpressed, was still love. I am 81 years old, and I read those words for the first time last spring, and I sat at my kitchen table and I wept in a way I have not wept since my wife died. Not from sadness exactly, or not only from sadness, from something more complicated than that, from grief for all the conversations we didn't have, yes, but also from a strange and unexpected comfort in knowing that he felt them too, that the door I spent my whole life unable to find had been there all along on both sides, and neither of us had known how to open it, and that this was not a failure of love, but a failure of language, a failure we inherited and never thought to question. I've been thinking about what I would say to him if I could. I've had a lot of quiet evenings to think about it. I think I'd want to tell him that I read the notebooks. I'd want him to know that I understand now, or at least that I understand more than I did. I'd want to tell him that the job offer he turned down in 1959 so as not to uproot his son. That son became a man who stayed in the same state his entire life and raised his own children near their grandparents, and that maybe some things travel even when they're never spoken. I'd want to ask him about the feeling he couldn't name. I'd want to tell him I have it too. I'd want to sit in the garage with him the way I never really did and just let it be quiet between us. But a different kind of quiet this time, a quiet where we both knew what was underneath it. If you're listening to this and your father is still alive, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're your own person, and your relationship is your own. But I'll tell you what I know from where I'm standing, which is at the far end of a long life with a cardboard box on my kitchen table. The things we assume about the people closest to us are often the things we've never once verified. The distance we feel from someone is sometimes made entirely of silence that could be broken, but that we've both decided, without ever discussing it, to leave intact. My father loved me in the only language he had. I'm grateful I finally learned to read it. I only wish it hadn't taken me this long.